What's up guys, Asian here again with a theory crafting video today, or less of a theory crafting video, more of a general how-to video, and this one we're going to be taking a look at how we're going to be using comment metrics reports, both how to read them and how to use them to help improve your DPS, as well as sort of identify problems with your raid group. And then we're also going to take a look at a corresponding ESO log, again, really quick breakdown of how to use ESO Logs, the website, to kind of see where your DPS is coming from, where your group can improve, and things like that. So both of these tools are very important for raiders to know how to use and use effectively in order to really understand what's going on in a raid group and kind of figure out exactly what's happening and how you can improve. So first, let's go over Combat Metrics. So Combat Metrics is an add-on, so you will need to obviously activate it, and it's usually combined with Constellations. Both of them are by the same author here, so Soliner/Decay. You'll commonly see these two being used together, mainly because Combat Metrics Constellations can import data from your Combat Metrics parse and provide you CP distributions. But the actual comment metrics report will look something like this. So let's go ahead and load up the example parse here. This is what your typical comment metrics report will look like. So obviously on the right hand side you have all of your buffs, and you can decide whether you want buffs, debuffs, and then you also have magic and stamina regen. These are useful to kind of figure out the magic and stamina, where your regen is coming from and what's using up the most amount of magicka. So for example here, the three top ones that are using up the most amount of magicka are Molten Whip, Unstable Wall, and Mystic Orb, which is to be expected because Unstable Wall and Mystic Orbs, along with Eruption, are all very expensive dots. And then Molten Whip is my spammable, so it just makes sense that Molten Whip is, being the most is giving me the most amount of drain just because I'm using it most often. And then down the bottom left, you will see all the different targets that you have hit throughout the parse. So the one that is highlighted here, in this case it'd be Yolnacrene, is usually going to be the boss. And it's usually, this DPS is the most important. If you take a look up here in the upper left, you'll get your overall DPS, which is basically the DPS for all of these sort of averaged together and weighted depending on how much time was spent. So for example, the Iron Servant, we didn't really spend that much time with it up, so we weren't fighting it very long. So even though we pulled 62.8k DPS, that has a lower weight compared to the Yolnacrene parse, because Yolnacrene is of course the boss and we're spending the most amount of time here. So this is probably not necessarily, like, if you see just the plain comment report, this is not really telling you the whole picture, because usually what's most important is the single target number that you see here on the bottom left. Then on the bottom right, you'll have basically a breakdown of all the abilities that you've used and how much damage that you are getting out of all these different abilities here. And they are usually ordered by how much they're contributing to your DPS. So you can see here as Magicka DK, light attacks are obviously the strongest here, about 10k DPS or so, and then your spammable and just kind of moving down from there. So this is helpful to figure out, one, what your light attack ratio is, and two, whether you have any downtime on dots. Now, in an actual raid parse like this, it's a little bit challenging to know what your light attack ratio truly is, because there is some downtime in the Yolnacrene fight where you're not actually attacking anything. So it's not really an accurate representation of what your actual light attack ratio should be. Same thing with dots, because there are going to be times where your dots are going to go down, especially in the Yolnacrene fight because of that flying phase. So for dummy parses though, your light attack ratio and your dot uptimes, they should be fairly accurate. Now you'll see here that I also have a couple of buffs and debuffs highlighted. You can pick which buffs you want to highlight by simply left clicking and putting the add to favorites. So for example, if I want to know how much I am maintaining my Sororia throughout the fight, I just basically put add to favorite to Sororia times 20, and that'll automatically bring it up to the very top here. So you can see here I do have a couple of very common buffs highlighted here. So Major Courage, Prophecy, Sorcery, Minor Courage, Warhorn, Minor Force, Minor Berserk, and so on. And the same thing with debuffs here. Now the thing with debuffs is that you will have to select your target. So for example, if I had no target selected, 41% uptime on Engulfing Flames, you would think that's not that great. But if you select Yolnacrene, you'll see we have selected the 6% uptime on Engulfing Flames. So just make sure you're selecting the appropriate target here. We'll go down to Iron Servant, for example, you can see that's different debuff uptimes. Now, that's how comment metrics looks. now how to use it to kind of figure out what's going on with your group, how you can improve, and so on. First thing is obviously taking a look at your light attack ratio. This is going to be better if you use a dummy parse. So for example, let's see, what's a dummy parse here? I think this is a dummy parse. Yeah, here's a dummy parse here. This is a raid parse. And you can see here we did 101 light attacks. Over here you have your time in combat, so it's minutes, seconds, milliseconds. So what you want to do is figure out how many seconds this is. So 1 minute is 60 seconds, plus 50 is 110 seconds. Your light attack ratio here would be 101 over 110, and that would be equivalent to about a 0.92 light attack ratio, which is pretty good. So in terms of light attacking, I'm pretty much hitting all light attacks I need to hit, and so on. Same thing with your dots. So blockade, for example, and twisting path, they should be close to around that 110 seconds uptime. So you can see blockade, it didn't let drop at all. I had 111 hits, so I didn't let blockade drop. Twisting path will let drop a little bit here, so 103. And this is for dots that take every 1 second. So for something like crippling grasp that hits every 2 seconds, you basically just take the number of hits, double it, and that will give you your approximate uptime. So here, 47, you double it, it gives you 94. So I did let crippling grasp drop off. Now, this is an older part, so this was back when you had to drop crippling grasp and execute for Nightblades. So that makes some more sense as to why Crippling Grasp has a lower uptime compared to Twisting Path and Blockade of Fire. Twisting Path also was dropped in Execute, so that's also why Twisting Path doesn't have 110 hits or higher. But this is generally speaking how you would kind of take a look at it from a dummy parse scenario. So just take a look at your light attack ratio. Ideally, it should be above 0.85. It is going to vary a little bit depending on class. So, for example, Magicka Templars and Stamina Templars will have a lower light attack ratio because your spam bull is a channeled for Stamplars, and for Magicklars, you're using J-Beam, which is a channeled as well. So your light attack ratio will be a little bit lower compared to like a Magicka Nightblade, where you don't have any channeled abilities. The next thing you're going to want to take a look at is going to be buffs and debuffs. So, for example, going back to our raid parse here with Yolnacreen, taking a look at buffs. One thing that I'm noticing is my minor force uptime is not high. It's 64%. I could be better with my minor force uptime. Now, of course, I am letting it drop off while Yolnacreen is flying, so 64% might actually be pretty accurate, and we'll go into the ESO Logs report to see whether or not this is true. But the other thing is minor berserk uptime too. It's 53% here, so it could be higher. Definitely 53% is, while it's not terrible, it's also not great either. It's sort of like, yeah, you're doing okay. Especially in a fight like Yolnacreen, minor berserk should be closer to 90 up to 100% uptime here. As for Sororia times 20, 48%, again, it's not very clear how well that is representative because Yolnacreen does have ups and downs. There are lulls in the fights where you're not actually able to hit anything. But I can probably do a better job at maintaining my Sororia buff here. 48%, again, not great, but it's also not terrible. So I do need to kind of work on getting my Sororia uptime up. Then Major Force uptime is 38%, Aggressive Horn is 81%, so we can see here that we can do a better job at making sure we're maintaining Aggressive Warhorn uptime. Ideally, you're going to want to have this as close to 100% as possible, so you do want to try to, one thing that we have to do now is to sort of make sure we're not letting the Horn buff drop off. Don't forget that even though the Major Force only lasts for 10 seconds, we're still getting 10% additional stamina and Magicka back, which does boost our DPS, so that's something that we should try to work towards 100% Warhorn uptime. Then we want to do the same thing with debuffs. So, for example, we take a look at Yolnacreen. We can see that Go from Flames uptime could be a little bit better. Major Breach is always going to be on the boss, so 90% uptime is going to be the max here. And we can see we are sitting at 76%. So, again, not that great. Under vulnerability, also not that great, 55%. Could be higher, especially because we have a Warden Healer in group. Using Fetcher Infection should be pretty easy to get close to 100% uptime in minor vulnerability, or 90% if we're using Major Breach as the maximum uptime because of that flying phase in Yolnacreen. Line Breaker, which is the Alkosh debuff, again, needs to get a little bit more work done here, so 44%. Again, not terrible, but it's also not great either. Off balance uptime is about what you would expect it to be, around 28%. And then Crusher uptime as well should be improved as well. 27% uptime on Crusher is, again, not fantastic. And if you just go down the line here, we can see all the different debuffs that we're getting. So, for example, the Stone Fist debuff was up for 60% of the time, so potentially some work can be done on that. Major vulnerability, that's the invulnerability. We can see here Touch of Zen, 41%. Touch of Zen should be 100%. It's fairly easy to get 100% uptime on the debuff itself. Now notice here that this is just a debuff. It's not telling us how much we're getting out of Zen. We're going to need to go into ESO logs in order to identify that stuff. You can see Fetcher Infection, not that great. The major vulnerability uptime could be a little bit better, but in this particular run, we only had, I believe, 3 Necromancers, so we're not going to be able to get the full 40% uptime of major vulnerability. Take 40% of 90% as our maximum uptime. We should be getting around 36%. So with 3 Necros, we're doing pretty decent. Also keep in mind that we do have, 40% of 90 does take into account the flying phase. So just something to keep in mind there. And then Way Marshal Knowledge, 22% here, which is not terrible again, but also not great either. So I will want to put those to my favorites just so they're all the way at the top here. But that's pretty much how you can sort of read a parse here. Now the other thing too that you'll notice is that I have max spell pen. I'm not hitting pen cap, so I will need to figure out kind of how to improve our overall pen. A lot of that is going to be taking a look at the crusher, see whether we're using the Torg's crusher or not, and then obviously making sure Alkosh uptime is better, because right now our mean spell pen is 14,800. So I kind of figure out, can we get our spell pen higher, because this is a pretty big disparity. We're losing a lot of DPS because we're not getting our pen all the way up. Whether that's something that DPS need to fix, maybe get some more points of spell erosion, or the supports just need to do a better job at maintaining our various uptimes on our breaches and our Alkosh and Crusher. We have to check the ESO logs to kind of see how that's all playing out. So speaking of ESO logs, I'm going to transition now over to ESO logs here, just so you guys can get a sense of how we can read an ESO log. Go ahead and hop on over here. So this is your typical ESO log. This is the exact same log from the parse that I mentioned earlier, the combat metric report. So I've already covered in 2 separate videos how to use ESO logs and how to kind of read them. But in this, so for here, we're not really going to be delving into that too much. Primarily what we're looking at here is going to be how do we now take the combat metrics report, which is kind of a summarized report, and kind of take a look into the nitty-gritty behind the various buffs and debuffs that I mentioned earlier. So the first thing is, let's take a look at the minor berserk. Remember, we had 53% uptime on me, so it's going to be under buffs. We're going to go gain by friendly here, as you can see up here. We're going to go under all abilities, go to M's, and then scroll down to minor berserk. You'll see we have 2. We're interested in looking at this one, and you can see here that this does reflect the combat metrics, so 53% uptime, and we can see where we're getting the minor berserk from. So just taking a look at where these sort of line up with me, and you can use the plus to kind of bring them up here. So for example, let's bring mine up, and then let's go ahead and bring up the 2 healers, because they're going to be the sources of minor berserk here. You can kind of see where they start to overlap. So you could also, if you'd like, just completely get rid of all of these, clean these all out, like so. And then you can put these on the main graph by clicking like that. It won't necessarily show up on all the graphs, so I like to keep them separate. But you can see here that these sort of line up more with this healer's combat prayer casts here. So you can see here, and this does reflect the stacks that we have. So this is the healer that's responsible for our stack in the Yoma Cream. So you can see here that this other healer is getting pretty good minor berserk uptime. Not 90% or anything like that, not 100%, but still very, very good, at least compared to the other healer where we're only getting around 50, high of maybe 60. We have 1 DPS that has below 50%, so we have 2 that are close to 50%. You can see here that just based on this, we need to take a look at this healer and say, hey, we are noticing your combat prayer uptime is not as good as the other healers. Can you pay attention to that on your next run? So that's one thing that you can take a look at. You can look at various buffs that you're getting. So let's say you're not really getting very good major courage uptime, then that's pretty obvious. It's whatever healer is wearing Olorime. Taking a look at debuff uptime. So let's say we want to, so now instead of gain by friendly, we want to cast by friendly. So let's say we want to take a look at what's one of the ones, minor vulnerability. So again, we take a look down here, go over here, take a look at the different minor vulnerabilities. We have 2. So this is the one with the most, so we'll actually leave this here, and we're going to take a look at the other source of random vulnerability. Here it is. Add the plus, so we have this above, and swap back to the one with more random vulnerabilities. If we can add this to the main graph here. No, it's not showing up. But you can see kind of where it's overlapping here. And we can see that we're getting pretty decent. And now we always want it just purely on Yolnacrine. So if you just select just Yolnacrine, you can see where the gaps in are being placed here. So we can see that we have a gap around here, which is probably when he's flying away. We have a few gaps here in the second phase, and then another big gap here, which is again probably the flying phase. Some more coverage here, and then a big gap here again. Probably again some flying phase here, and then some here. So even though the random vulnerability might not seem very high, just based on the ESO logs, it does seem like we're getting a good amount of random vulnerability. This is mainly, it looks like, from other sources outside of vector infection. So we're getting some from various, it looks probably shock damage. A lot of this does seem to be shock damage. So we have a Sork, for example, 2 Sorks actually. So probably a lot of shock damage is responsible for all this uptime. But we don't necessarily want to rely on this because shock damage is not 100% consistent. So we do want to point out, again, to this healer here, hey, random vulnerability uptime on vector infection is not that great. Can we make sure we are getting good uptime on vector infection? Because we're noticing that you're letting it drop off a lot. So this is again a way you can use ESO logs to kind of figure out, okay, what's happening here, what's going on. And take a look at a different debuff here. Let's take a look at Wave Marshal Knowledge, for example. And we can see here that we have a big gap here. So we can say, hey, Marshal Knowledge uptime is not as great as it used to be. There, we notice there's a gap here, so just make sure you're using Marshal Knowledge on cooldown here. And, we have a gap here, which can be explained with flying, but again, another gap here, big gap here, a giant gap over here, and another big gap towards the end here. So we can basically say, hey, just make sure that you're keeping an eye on your stamina, making sure you're proccing Marshal Knowledge, making sure your stamina is below 50% the whole, when you need to proc it, because 22% on Marshal Knowledge, not that great. If you want to, you want probably around 40% on Yolnacrine. Again, 90% is your max uptime, theoretical max uptime using a major breach as our standard. Max uptime you can get is about 60%, so 60% of 90 would be roughly 54% or so would be your highest maximum uptime. So if you're hitting around 40, that's pretty good for Marshal Knowledge. So again, this is to be a way that you can kind of use ESO logs, kind of be like, hey, we're noticing debuff uptimes are a little bit low. Let's focus on that on our next run. Make sure we're getting really good uptime on our Marshal Knowledge here. You can see that we did start off with getting some good procs here. A little bit of a downtime here, a little bit longer than it should be. But generally speaking, we are proccing it more or less on cooldown here. But then there's this big gap. So something happened here in this big gap that we need to figure out what's going on here to see what was happening. Maybe he was focusing more on healing rather than debuffing. Maybe he was heavy attacking instead of light attacking, because where Marshal Knowledge does proc off of light attacks, for example. So again, you can kind of figure it out now. This is the time frame we got to look at. Let's go ahead and take a look at what was happening here. So if we go over to resources and take a look at stamina for that one healer, so that would be this healer here, and take a look at the times. You can see that our stamina here below 50%, pretty good. But that's starting from this point onward, we're getting more than 50%. This is why Marshal Knowledge wasn't that great. We had a lot of stamina. Maybe something was happening here. Maybe there was some incoming damage. So this would be around 43 seconds up to minute 14. So we can go ahead and take a look at damage taken. What was happening with the damage taken? Damage taken here seems to be a little bit higher on the higher side, but then it dips down. So shouldn't be a problem of damage being taken and having to heal too much. You can see here we have the deaths here. So no deaths, so he wasn't necessarily rezzing anybody or anything like that. So what about casts? Let's go ahead and take a look at. Well, we shouldn't take a look at casts. It's actually not a good measurement to take a look at. Healing should be pretty similar to damage taken. So again, we're not 100% certain what was going on here. So take a look at cast here, and we take a look at the healer. During here, let's just take a look at just the light attacks. So we can see light attacks, he's not missing any light attacks. There's a brief period here where he's not light attacking anything. a period of about 10 seconds or so. But there are light attacks between 43 and a minute 17, so we're not 100% sure what's going on here. Let's take a look at bashing. Perhaps he wasn't bashing at all during that time, and we can see, yes, that's what might have been happening. We're not getting enough bashes going. We are getting some over here, and this is where we start getting the our we have Marshal Knowledge up again. So let's go ahead and put this up here. So take a look at our resources again. Stamina here. You can see that these bashes here correspond to this sharp dip, and this is where our Marshal Knowledge is going to be coming into play again. Again, if we go to debuffs and go to cast by friendly, and we go to Marshal Knowledge, and then just add that in up here. You can see that once we get our stamina back down again, you can see Marshal Knowledge procced. So there was this period here where he wasn't bashing, and that was causing our stamina to go up. Then he started bashing again. Stamina went back down once we hit around less than 50. This is when Marshal Knowledge started to proc again. Then we see this sharp dip up. This is probably when he was flying. Then a sharp dip down, which corresponds to probably dodge rolling. These sharp dips here probably correspond to dodge rolling. Then we can see Marshal Knowledge again. Then for this big dip here, we can see that he's not bashing enough. You can see that he did do one bash here, which did drop his stamina down, but not enough to proc Way of Marshal Knowledge, and then again started to climb back up. So this corresponds to a drop in bashing, and so on and so forth. So we can basically pull this apart and be like, okay, we can see here, you're not bashing during this time. Just make sure you're bashing to maintain that less than 50% stamina here. So again, really a little bit tricky. You kind of have to jump around a little bit, but it is possible to use ESO logs to kind of identify what's going on here with, in this case, the Way of Marshal Knowledge debuff uptime. What's going on here? We can see, okay, your stamina is not low enough. Why is your stamina not low enough? Because you're not bashing. So this is one way you can use ESO logs, and you can kind of repeat this all over again for different debuffs and different buffs, kind of figure out, okay, what's happening here? Is it just you're not casting Combat Prayer enough? Is it you're casting Combat Prayer but you're not hitting anybody? Etc, etc. This is how you can kind of break down exactly what's happening on your combat metrics as well as ESO logs. They kind of figure out, okay, this is what we need to improve on next raid. Got to bash more often for this healer. Got to make sure we're having up 100% uptime with Veteran Infection for our other healer. Make sure we're getting Common Prayer down. Making sure you're hitting everybody with Common Prayer. DPS, make sure you're standing in your stack. Maybe we weren't in the stack. So you did notice with Common Prayer, for example, that some of us weren't getting hit. So is that a positioning issue for DPS, or is that a positioning issue for healers? So that's kind of how you would use ESO logs to kind of tease apart those slight differences, those small differences, and kind of explaining how things are working out here. So again, with combat metrics, you're getting a very broad view here. So again, you don't really see those nuances with Way of Marshal Knowledge. All you see is a 22% uptime, but you're not seeing the ESO logs that break down when it's going up and etc. So combining combat metrics with an ESO logs is probably the best way to kind of identify what's going on, how you can best improve the group via buffs and debuffs. But that concludes this video. Let me know down in the comment section below if you guys would want some more guidance on how to tease apart ESO logs and how to best use ESO logs. Myself and a couple of other people have been doing a really good job of kind of parsing through ESO logs and taking a look at all the different functionalities of ESO logs and really using them to help improve our raid groups. That concludes this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. Again, let me know down in the comment section below if you want even a longer video or a series of videos kind of explaining how to best use ESO logs. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.